At least some of you have come back anyway, that's a good sign. Okay, so as I was saying right at the beginning, quite a lot of information. Still a bit to go, but it should all start joining up over the next couple of sessions. And obviously, if you've got questions, then there'll be time for that as well. So, yeah, we've covered quite a bit of ground already. I'm going to start moving through the rest of the biology and then a bit more onto the neurology and the psychology and stuff. And then if there's time at the end, I've got a couple of short film clips that you might find interesting, having gone through the talk. We'll just see how the time goes. So basically, I'm saying, just to recap, that the unique features that make us human, particularly the features we aspire to that aren't so much on display anymore, are profound wisdom and intelligence and our capacity for compassion and empathy and all those kind of things, came out of a very unique relationship with the forest, a symbiotic relationship with the reproductive organs of flowering plants. And since that time, since that relationship broke down, we've been reverting slowly to a more typical mammalian type. And although I haven't mentioned this yet, I'll probably mention it again in a bit, because our brain was always genetically asymmetric. One side was genetically distinct to the other side, always was. The way we're moving in this kind of reversion process is one side of our brain is reverting more quickly. It's effectively maturing more quickly. One side of our brain's actually becoming more mature more quickly than the other side. And we tend to think that's normal and that's the way it should be, which kind of is the case for pretty much all of the mammals. But it's the very thing that's crushing out this unique juvenile psychology and unusual abilities. So that's kind of a summary. Like I say, with all of this, don't necessarily take my word for it, because I have a left brain and it's liable to tell all sorts of lies and be deluded and so on. So please check it for yourself. You know, reread, look at the data. Is it possible that we have one side of our brain in charge that's quite dysfunctional, and the more functional side of our brain that we do get a little bit of access to is where the relics of our amazing abilities and amazing psychology still live. So, yeah, if there was any validity to this, we would expect to see a few clues at least. I mean, I'm really proposing quite a serious species-wide neurological condition. It afflicts everybody, but there is a spectrum of severity. It afflicts men to a significantly higher degree than women, but again, there's a spectrum there as well. And at the far extreme of it, what you see is the kind of emergence of sociopathic and psychopathic traits. And they're the kind of traits we do see in other animals. They're normal, but in humans, they're obviously very negative. We'd also, there'd be evidence for mechanisms. There'd have to be a way to explain this. There'd have to be a mechanism to understand this. And I've mentioned flavonoids quite a lot. They're coming in for an awful lot of attention and research at the minute. Pharmaceutical companies are very interested. They obviously want to patent and synthesize and come up with crappy copies of flavonoids to sell you at extremely high prices. In fact, it's worth, next time you're on Google doing a bit of research, you'll find that quite a lot of pharmaceutical chemicals are actually based on flavonoids. Of course, the flavonoids can't be patented, and you can get them in your diet, and you can take extra in supplement form. But the point is, they exist. There's a lot of research now, and they display varying properties. Quite a large percentage of them are powerful antioxidants. That's great if you're building a big brain. You need to keep it protected because it's very susceptible to oxidization. Another big percentage of them are neuroactive. They interact with our neural system, elevate its activity. And if this was the fuel, the neurochemical fuel that we evolved to run on, and we'll find out in a bit how chronically neurochemically deficient we are now. And it's not surprising, we're always trying to self-medicate. We might not get it right, we might look in the wrong places, but we have a neural system that's effectively starved of neurochemistry. Then, of course, I mentioned the hormonal effects. They interact directly with the DNA, flavonoids. So they're reading the DNA independently, and then also, and probably more importantly, they change the way our own hormones work. They change the way estrogens and testosterone work, generally dampening them down, diluting them, inhibiting them, stopping them working in the way that they would have done in a very archaic past when we were more typical mammals, and allowing us to become kind of more juvenile in our form. So this exists. Research is literally every week there's stuff coming out about flavonoids. 20 years ago there's very little. Now there's a whole mountain of stuff. No context, of course. We're not being told that we were flooded with this stuff 24/7 for millions of years, which actually the evidence is there that we were. We're just being told in little bits and pieces, oh, this is rich in this is rich in that. I talked a bit about the kind of standard thinking about DNA code and that being the source of variation and mutation. That has been the standard paradigm for a long time, still is in many ways, but there's a lot more interest now in how the DNA code is read. It's finally being realized that in fact there's a lot more mileage there, that you can read the library many, many different ways and come up with very different end products. So this is getting a lot of attention now. It's mostly seen as real time, but again, there's evidence starting to emerge that this can affect us through the generations. So no change in code, but you can change the way the code's read, and it will produce effects that ripple through the generations. Some of these slides are just summaries, stuff we've already covered. Again, standard thinking, which kind of makes sense. Our distant ancestors were insect eating, and in their pursuit of insects they formed a relationship with the sex organs of flowers, and eventually along with other species induced this symbiotic relationship to emerge where the sex organ swells, and that becomes the reward for seed dissemination and so on. Massive change in formula. So insect eating tends not to lead to a unique brain. In fact, there's parallels in insect-eating bats and fruit bats. Fruit bats tend to have larger brain and are seen as more intelligent. They're obviously limited as to what size of brain they can grow because of flight constrictions. And fruit eating generally seems to change the neural system. A lot of parrots eat a lot of fruit and they're regarded as highly intelligent. So there's a connection there that's not just with primates. So again, trying to get away from the idea of diet, and particularly the idea of fruit, and really seeing what a highly evolved, highly specialized organ it is, and it's absolutely cram-packed full of literally mind-altering substances, real-time, the neurochemistry, but also hormonally changing the structure of our brain. And I do focus a lot on our cerebral brain. I'm not saying we are a brain. I'm not even saying it generates who we are, but I kind of go along with the idea that at the very least it's like some kind of mind-bogglingly complex lens, like a molecular lens with billions of layers and complexity, and tweaking it even with small amounts of chemistry can have a massive impact on it. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of how a small amount of psychedelics can have a massive impact on your perception. Well, if you think the change we've gone through, the chemistry that builds and runs our neural system from fairly standard to something incredibly unique and incredibly rich, and back to something utterly bizarre and pretty bereft of any useful chemistry. So the idea that it wouldn't have had a massive impact seems absurd to me. And the evidence for all of this is quite good. Touch on the pineal gland a little bit. All of these areas could probably talk for a whole day on. But the pineal gland's getting a lot more attention these days. It was always a little bit sort of in the realms of esoteric spirituality, but a lot more research gone on, and I've been talking a bit about the juvenilizing effects of fruit. You pour fruit into the system, it is a cocktail of juvenile-inducing chemistry. That creates a juvenile environment. We grow a more juvenile new layer of brain. It runs a more juvenile hormone system. And part of that hormone system is the pineal gland. So remember, fruit tends to inhibit the effects of estrogens and testosterone. That changes everything, changes our developmental windows, changes the structure of our brain. That's why male and female brains are quite different in their structure. But I suspect at one time they were much more similar when the fruit was flooding through and keeping us both in a more juvenile form. And of course, say flavonoids also neuroactive. Well, interestingly enough, the pineal gland used to be thought to be something that you couldn't easily influence. It was fairly isolated, and it just ran day and night, producing more chemistry in nighttime, less in the day, although in younger people it tends to work harder all the time, which is interesting. But what they did discover, that certain classes of compounds can affect the pineal, certain classes of monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Funnily enough, flavonoids, a lot of the flavonoids are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So basically you can stimulate the pineal with some of your dietary choices, and some of the chemistry the pineal produces, so you've got this fruit effect going on. Pineal itself produces chemicals such as melatonin, pinealine. There's even increasing evidence that it produces DMT, although it's still a little bit speculative. But you think about it, the fruit's fueling a big change, and it starts driving some of these very powerful hormonal glands, and they start producing chemistry that kind of parallels what the fruit's doing. If anything, it's a lot more powerful. So for example, melatonin, very powerful antioxidant. It's also very strongly correlated with juvenile states. We produce a lot more melatonin when we're younger, when we're juvenile, and it dampens down testosterone and estrogen. Similar effect to flavonoids. Same with pinealine. Pinealine, another chemical it produces, happens to be a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, so it's neuroactive, it's fueling the brain's activity, also inhibits testosterone and estrogens. And then DMT, obviously, a lot been written on that in recent years, very powerful neurochemical. So this gland can produce all the similar effects that fruit can produce, and actually you start eating more fruit and it elevates the activity of the pineal gland. So again, you get into these feedback loops. You start eating more fruit, it starts pushing your own hormone system into a more juvenile state, producing more neurochemicals, and that accelerates the process even further. It starts to offer an answer as to why our neural system isn't just big, but that it expanded at such a phenomenal rate. Keep emphasizing how expensive neural systems are to build, how expensive they are to run, and clearly the vast majority of species that have ever existed appear to have not needed a very big brain to survive. It's got nothing to do with survival. Animals have survived phenomenally well with minuscule brains. But if it was a byproduct of this kind of feedback mechanism, it all starts to make sense, and it explains why it could have happened so rapidly, and then why it stopped all of a sudden, and why it's been shrinking. Not locked in the DNA, but the way the DNA has been read, the way the fruit affects the DNA, and the fruit affects a hormone system which also affects the DNA. And the pineal gland is one of the more powerful glands for doing that. And it's interesting as well, in our current state, the pineal gland, as I say, tends to be more active at night, less so in the day, particularly as adults when we've reached that mature state. But you can activate the pineal gland by getting into meditative states. Certain neurochemicals will activate it. Things like cannabis will activate the pineal gland. And I suspect a lot of these ancient practices or treatments were all about trying to get into a more right hemisphere dominant state, which is in turn a more juvenile, it's the relics of a more juvenile, more advanced system, and it runs the pineal gland. It'll push the pineal gland to work harder. Whereas a normal left brain dominant state, it's a more primitive state. It doesn't run the pineal gland in the same way, it's much less active. So it's kind of like in one state we're fueling a kind of positive feedback loop. As we slip into this more mature state, it fuels a negative feedback loop. Less of these chemicals, we mature more quickly. In fact, I think it, it's made it into the press a lot in the last 10 years or so. Our age of sexual maturity has been dropping very rapidly. We're maturing much more quickly, and even within the last 100 years, the age of sexual maturity has dropped by perhaps at least 10%. That's just in 100 years. And this is a very window we need to build our complex neural system. We're losing that window. People think, oh, well, we're just maturing more quickly, it's not a big deal. And in some ways they're right, but it's the maturation process as it is our enemy. It was this very extended juvenile window, and then retaining a lot of juvenile features that set us apart, that gave us this unique sense of self. And that's all collapsing. We're rapidly maturing now. We're losing all those traits, and we're moving towards a typical mature mammalian brain, which just doesn't have this capacity. One other clue, I think, with the pineal as well, you might find interesting. There's quite an ancient tradition of urine therapy. I don't know if you've come across that. Some of you might have done. There's been a lot of speculation about what is the purpose of that, what are the benefits. And in some of the traditions, they talk about early morning urine being best, or even slightly more creepily, the urine of juvenile. Juvenile is far better. Well, one of the few things that comes out in our urine that varies between day and night, or what age we are, is melatonin. And if we're chronically deficient in melatonin and we're losing it through our urine, it's a way of recycling it. So it suggests that there was an attempt to restore some of our melatonin levels by drinking morning urine, or the urine of juveniles. And this was part of the yogic tradition and other related traditions. You can get synthetic melatonin, and it's a very simple molecule. I'm not a fan of synthetic molecules, but some molecules are quite easy to copy, so you don't need to drink urine anymore. You can just get a melatonin supplement. But interesting that that correlation is there anyway. This is just another summary again, covering lots of areas, just reminding you how all these bits fit together. And we've gone again from this incredibly bizarre, biochemically incredibly complex relationship with the flowering plants through various stages. And for the most part now, the dominant part of our construction materials, our build materials, the grass seed. We've given them all sorts of fancy names, like rice and barley and wheat and corn. But actually it's grass seed. They're all part of the same family, and they do not want to be eaten. They're very chemically defended, cause all sorts of problems. So the only way we can eat them is to heavily process them, grind them and beat them and bake them and boil them and microwave them, and then they're not poisonous anymore. But of course, in doing that, to destroy the molecular defense, we also destroy whatever else is in there. And that's pretty much the basis of what we build our neural system from now. The most complex neural system we know, we build it from grass seed. It's got nothing to do with primate evolution. Very, very few species specialize in eating grass seed because it's so toxic. Tubers as well. So grass seed and tubers. But even then, look at what we do to them. Slice them up and boil them in fat. So very, very high temperatures, oxidizes everything. In fact, we do this, again, I mentioned our neural system, our nervous system is predominantly built from fats, certain kinds of fats, very, very delicate fats, and they're very, very susceptible to oxidization, rusting basically. And yet we now take all that stuff and we heat it and free oxygen, often at very high temperatures. And we can't make, like these omega-3s, we can't make them. They're called essential because we can't make them. We have to get them from outside. So once we've done that damage to them, that's it. We can't change them. They're just used as part of the build of our neural system. So again, this is a superstructure. We're building it from complete rubbish. It's a bit grim, but I think it's essential to, figure out how bad things have got before we can start turning it around. So, most complex neural system we know, most complex ecology we know. Are they related? Seems pretty obvious, but it's taking time to get people interested. But there is interest, and I have had interest from quite a lot of well-known academics starting to recognize that the current thinking just doesn't add up. I've been trying to shoehorn savanna ideas together for years, and there's just so many gaps in it, it just doesn't work. Again, clues from other areas. Touched on this already. I think it's worth sort of bearing in mind how stuck we are on our day-to-day way of being. I certainly include myself in this. And our mode of communication is so limited. I think you occasionally see these kind of episodes on various series and stuff where, for whatever reason, the director or the writers have decided that it's all going to be done like opera, and the actors all have to sing. I think the world would be a lot better place if we all adopted that. We sung our communication to each other. Might be a bit scary to start with, but I suspect it would also be highly amusing. But more than that, it would take us to a different state of mind. And anybody who does sing, a lot of people who I've spoken to who sing say that's part of the attraction. Singing actually is part of a way of getting into what we currently consider an altered state of consciousness. I think it's just the relics of a more normal consciousness. But if you look at the data, actually we have it back to front. Speech is really a dumbed-down version of singing. And when you look at the split brain research, when the hemispheres are separated, and even the limited intonation we have in speech is lost, it becomes very monotone. That's the left hemisphere's capacity, this monotone, computer-like voice it has, and that's supposed to be the advanced version. Of course, that's according to the left hemisphere. Remember, there's always this loop in all the data. The left hemisphere is always giving itself a highly advanced, clean bill of health, even though the evidence is screaming the opposite. It's like we always find a way to somehow make it okay that we're advanced and everything's working fine. But I think there's a lot of very powerful clues suggest exactly the opposite. There's a lot of clues come out from our current definitions of sanity and insanity. I think they're very skewed anyway. They're partly a product of an insane mind in the first place. But there's a long history of people who've written and commented on the kind of eccentricities that can go with genius and savant-like skills. For the most part, you almost need a more damaged rational mind to get access, where it's losing control. So you get this in savant syndrome, autistic savants, and a lot of people that display a lot of high degree of intelligence, they often display eccentric traits as well. And I think it's because our access is limited by the rational mind, and it's only as it starts to lose control or become even more dysfunctional in a lot of cases that we begin to get access. So we get people who are quite brilliant, but also got hints of madness going on as well. This is another area that obviously a lot's been written on, but it's something we tend to not want to confront head on. Fear is a classic symptom of mental ill health. If you're losing function, if you're losing your sensory perception, losing your sight, losing your hearing, the world starts to become a more frightening place, at least initially. Well, if our neural system's in decline, or at least part of it's in decline, it's degenerating, it's losing function, It's losing its capacity to perceive reality, and the evidence is good for that. Then the world becomes a more frightening place. And it's amazing, if we're honest, how much fear drives our lives, how frightened we are. We all have a veneer, we all have a coping mechanism, we all exchange communication as if that's not the case, and yet fear of how we're perceived, how others perceive us, seems to dominate. And we really don't want to admit to it. We don't want anybody else stepping out of line and highlighting our own fear. So there's all these rules to keep us all safe and in a way that we don't have to confront the reality that we're actually all variably paranoid and quite terrified. And if that is the case, then what is the underlying cause? The flip side of that is a lot of these treatments that I keep talking about, these ancient practices from yoga, meditation, and so on, they all allude to being able to find a state where the fear just drops away. You get into a state, and it's not a naive state. It's not an inability to be aware and take appropriate action. It's just not driven by fear. It's more like heightened awareness, that kind of Zen type state. In fact, a lot of the martial arts traditions, the deepest origins it was really about mind. It was about learning to master your mind and getting into a state where everything worked phenomenally well. Reflexes were quicker, everything was quicker, and there wasn't fear. You weren't clouded by fear. It was just acute awareness. But for the most part, that's not where most of us are. We're mostly driven by insecurity and fear. And again, that's a classic symptom of mental ill health, being paranoid and frightened. And it can be highlighted, again, a lot of people self-experiment. In our culture, there's not much of a history anymore. But a lot of the chemicals that can stimulate the right hemisphere exclusively, in doing so, they wrestle control from the dominant left hemisphere. So you can get a mixture of even more fear and paranoia as the control is being lost, which then in turn breaks through into sublime kind of divine experience. But the two things can run parallel initially. And all that seems to go on in a lot of people's experience. These aren't rare experiences, these are very common experiences. So we seem to be this strange mixture of paranoid terror and potential for feeling some kind of sublime divinity. Again, having just touched on that, certainly plenty of evidence that the wiring exists for these states, and history is littered with accounts of these states. They have similar themes, and people still access them now to varying degrees. But the questions that seem important to me is why do we need any techniques at all? Why do we need to do meditation? Why do we need to do yoga? Why do we take plant medicines? Why doesn't it just work anyway? Why is there so much resistance, and why is there so much collective fear of it? We live in a time where increasingly anything that can lead us to feeling those states, anything to do with pleasure, anything to do with feeling less fear, has been slowly marginalized or prohibited, whether it's even dance and music right the way through to practices and medicines that can help our mind. We've become so frightened that we've tried to stay in control. I'm talking collectively here now. We've imposed restrictions on anything that changes what is incredibly damaging, an incredibly damaging state of mind. We'd rather hang on to that, looking what it's doing, than start putting some of the things in that we know work. The reason we know they work is because we've legislated against them. There wouldn't be legislation if they didn't work. So quite strange what we're doing. And we do know, there's an awful lot of information now. We already know an awful lot about how to create a state of mind relatively safely that's a lot more functional, free, or relatively free from paranoia and fear, and the need to be in control, which is one of the biggest symptoms that's causing all the damage. States of mind that feel so much better. We do know how to do those things relatively safely. I've mostly focused on, my biggest interest has been our individual and collective psychology and perception, our general state of mind. And I've focused on things that could have impacted on our neural development, our neural function, our neural system being incredibly sensitive to chemistry and hormonal changes and so on. But I figured a while back that if that were the case, if we'd gone through this window of massive changes and then lost those changes, or were losing those changes again, other parts of our physiology would show some symptoms as well. There'd be some strangeness going on, I guess, in areas that are very sensitive to these changes. And one area, well, there's a couple of areas, but one area is human reproduction. Loads written about human reproduction and a lot of the anomalies in human reproduction. But it starts to make a lot more sense if you kind of extrapolate and reverse engineer. You start imagining how our system might have worked if it was flooded with the biochemistry of fruit and a more active pineal gland and a more juvenile endocrine system. And a lot of the things that we currently think are normal almost certainly wouldn't have been normal. I think one of the examples is the archaic estrus cycle and how that's transformed into the kind of current theories and models around human ovulation and menstruation and so on, and also menopause. And this can all be framed in a sort of framework of significant or serious hormone deficiency, or at least protective hormonal deficiency anyway. Because a lot of the chemicals that I've talked about in fruit, amongst the many other things they do, they're generally considered contraceptive. They inhibit the mechanisms we currently understand, dampen them down. If you put that together with a more active pineal gland, then you end up with instead of a cycle, you end up with a much slower maturation process. Sexual maturity takes a lot longer, and there's historical records to suggest that, you know, we've witnessed that in recent times, that the age of sexual maturity is dropping. But even in relatively recent times, it was late teens and possibly even later as you wind the clock back. But then you end up eventually with a sort of a state that's just about sexually mature. I think that's one of the things that set us apart. We retained a lot of our juvenility into, well, for the rest of our lives, and we were at a point where we only just reached a degree of sexual maturity that allowed us to breed. And it was nothing to do with hormones cycling. It was all held in position by sustained fruit chemistry and a very different hormonal system. Melatonin's also been tested for a contraceptive, quite effective. So we were pumping all these chemicals that inhibited the ancient estrus cycle, and our hormones were reinforcing that. And it starts to make sense of some of the mechanisms that would have emerged to deal with that, because this whole formula to build this unusual neural system and give us an unusual state of mind was kind of heading in the direction of very powerful contraception, which actually, in terms of a species surviving, isn't very helpful. It becomes a lethal kind of change if you can't breed. And a lot of species have particular mechanisms that trigger breeding, changes in day length, changes in hormone, and even sexual activity is also another trigger for to induce ovulation, to allow breeding. So when you put all this together, it looks like something like that might have happened with humans, where it was getting more and more difficult to breed, or at least to induce ovulation because of all these chemical effects. And it may explain the emergence of orgasm, particularly heightened orgasmic states. Again, remember that we both start off effectively as a female model, and then with hormonal change, males are a more altered version of the female model. And in males, there's a very clear connection between orgasm and what is effectively ovulation. It's a parallel of ovulation, because the sex organs sort of start off similar and differentiate in different directions. So the testes and the ovaries are essentially the same thing, just hormonally modified. So it may explain the emergence of orgasmic states, particularly heightened orgasmic states, which are also linked to traditional approaches to altered states, as the only means to induce ovulation. All that changes when you lose all this chemistry. It then starts reverting to a more typical mammalian form where the estrous cycle begins to re-emerge, but not exactly as it was, and you end up with ovulation that isn't stimulated by any sexual activity. It just kind of goes through this cycle of ovulation, then the system tries to repair itself, but there's nothing to hold it anymore. There's not the fruit hormones to hold it anymore. There's not the pineal gland to hold it anymore. It goes back into a kind of a relentless cycle of ovulate, rebuild, and eventually tends to burn out a lot earlier than it would have done. As humans are also fairly unique in menopause, i.e. becoming sexually or no longer sexually functional at a relatively early part of our life. So there's a lot of clues there. Again, it's an area that we could probably spend a whole day on, but I'd certainly suggest, if you're interested in this whole area, start having a look at human reproduction and start considering how it might look under a very different hormone regime, and does it make any sense? And there are still clues, even today there are still clues where some of these traits do emerge. Obviously hinted at this a bit already, but a little bit more specific. Testosterone isn't exclusively a male hormone, but males do typically produce more of it. It's a big part of what turns us into males, and has a big impact on our neural structure, our neural function. If our hormones had been dampened down by the effects of fruit for long periods of time, then the difference between males and females wouldn't be as extreme. We'd be a lot closer to each other physiologically and neurologically. But since that breakdown, males have got hit hardest with testosterone, and it's a particularly powerful hormone. It changes neural structure. And I've gone as far as saying it's basically the re-emergence of hierarchy and patriarchy, particularly male-dominated, isn't some kind of new social sort of structure. It's actually a symptom of neurological damage. As our neural systems begun to fail, these more primitive, aggressive traits have risen to the surface, and it's really driven by fear and control. You lose function, and the world becomes more frightening. There's more need for control, and that's exactly what you see sort of happening over the last few thousands of years. More limited mind, hell-bent on control, and then creating the world in its own image. So I think the emergence of patriarchy is really a symptom of neural degeneration. It's not really done us any favors, that's for sure. And kind of hinted at this already. There's a lot of traditions that have kind of been rediscovered in the West over time, really looking at how to utilize the more easy to access experiences we can get to that correlate with altered states. So pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure, and the neural or the imaging studies tend to support this. The kind of profound experiences people have tend to require a shift in hemispheres. Our left hemisphere doesn't feel an awful lot. Its pleasures are very limited. It tends to feel excited when it feels safe and secure, when it's in control. It can feel fear. It doesn't feel a lot of other things. So to feel those kind of deep pleasure, you have to allow yourself to shift. It's why those kind of states can be a kind of mixed thing, where there's a lot of fear and then you get into these deeper states. So the idea is some of these traditions try and harness that and utilize the pleasure mechanisms to get you into that altered state and then build on that to become a more expansive state. And also interesting that we've, like a lot of things, we've become, or a percentage of our society, the more frightened percentage of our society has become incredibly paranoid with anything that might induce any kind of shift. And I think were it not for our imminent extinction, sex would have been completely outlawed by some groups who are so frightened of that letting go, that state of extreme pleasure. In fact, our left brain society is terrified of extreme pleasure. It's okay if you get excited about buying something new, but if it's actually a much deeper pleasure, then you probably end up in prison for it. So there's lots of layers to this, and it's sometimes easy to forget how bizarre it's become because we've grown up with it. Another area that's very sensitive to hormonal change is the immune system. So again, this is another area I looked at just to see if there were any clues. And thymus gland's very interesting. It's a significant part of our immune system. And it tends to be much more active and larger when we're juvenile and still growing, still developing. Once the steroids that we currently consider to be normal kick in, the steroid levels, the estrogens and testosterones kick in and start making all those changes, thymus gland starts to shrink. And in fact, some treatments for some conditions are now based on trying to reverse that process, trying to inhibit the steroid effect on the thymus gland to get it working more. Of course, in an evolutionary context, it might make sense of these Arcadian myths of great longevity and supreme health if we lived in a perpetual state of hormone modulation where our own primitive hormones were kept in check. And a lot of these systems were allowed to flourish and develop right through our lives rather than just until we reach puberty. Yet another fascinating area. Again, this whole book's written on this now, but up until about the 1970s, certainly in Western science, this was pretty much unheard of. Although there are hints in other traditions that go way, way back, sort of chi energy, gut energy. Anyway, it turns out that our gut isn't just some kind of tube that we shove stuff in and stuff comes out the other end and we hope to get a bit of nutrition out of it along the way. Turns out our gut is an incredibly complex neural system as well as other things. It has more neural tissue than our spinal cord. So it's a very advanced piece of neural tissue, runs on the same chemistry as our brain. And this was all pretty much discovered by one guy in, I think, the late 60s and 70s. He discovered one class of chemicals in the gut that he knew were in the brain. Then he discovered more, and then he began to propose, well, actually, our gut looks like it's a neural system. And his peers and people generally thought he was bonkers, but over time that gained credibility and the evidence became very powerful, which I think adds several layers to this whole process, but particularly when you think about what we put in our guts, you now have to start thinking that your gut's a highly advanced neural system. So what is it you want to be putting in there? And in addition, if our gut, like our cerebral system, if they both evolved for a very long period in this incredibly complex chemical environment, the plant chemistry, then those lengths of time, that chemistry becomes the default operating system. That's the necessary operating system. We basically need very complex plant biochemistry to get our neural systems working, whether it's our cerebral system or a gut system. should be flooded with complex plant chemistry. That's what it's designed to run on. I just put this in really to, again, my interest is our behavior, our collective behavior, and my concerns that we're hell-bent on self-destruction. And is there a way to kind of come up with a diagnosis that could change that? But I wanted to kind of make it clear that I didn't think this was all about psychology and perception. There are certainly plenty traditions and also plenty of anecdotal evidence that our current physical capacities, our athletic capacities and so on, may be limited by the neural management we have in place, and that we have way, way more capacity if we can free ourselves. It's like we have a very poor management system. So if you can switch out of that into a more functional state, then without any additional training or anything, everything just starts to work a lot better, or even phenomenally better. And again, a lot of interesting evidence to support that. In fact, there's a book called, or there's a couple of books, Psychic Side of Sports, and In the Zone, I think, was the later version, was looking at extreme athletic performance and people who were athletes already, but who had these one-off performances where they just excelled their own expectations, went beyond what anybody thought was possible. And virtually all those experiences correlate with an altered state. It almost pushed themselves to their left brain limit, and in doing that, pushed beyond that. And they often, or typically, reported kind of altered state, or it was as if it was all took place in an altered state. Time slowed down. I floated past the opposition. It didn't hurt anymore, etc., etc. So it's like we have a second management system that can allow us vastly better physical performance as well. And it's hinted at again, I think I mentioned it before, in some of the ancient traditions that I guess some of them were the origins of some of the martial arts traditions, where it was really about training the mind, less so than the body. It was working on the mind till eventually you got out of the ego mind, the monkey mind, whatever you want to call it. And without having to think, it was almost getting that thinking out of the way, then it starts to work. But of course, it's a very difficult thing to do. It's like, well, I'm not thinking about it, but I'm thinking about not, it's all those kind of traps. But the whole system set in place, monastic systems, where eventually you get out of that mind and then your body works phenomenally better. The kind of zen of running and this zen of archery, all those kind of things. And I, again, on a very, very limited level, got hints of that during extreme sleep deprivation, where little bits of function started to emerge. Even though I should have been exhausted and totally dysfunctional, things actually started to work better and felt better as well. So the idea is we have a latent physical function, but it's really because we're locked into an inefficient management system. The part of our brain that's in charge of everything just isn't very good at what it does. I'm probably going to skip a couple of these text slides because they're a bit heavy going. Really just saying that our neural system's incredibly sensitive to change. The evidence, including the orthodox evidence, suggests massive, massive change. And from all the reductionist perspective, it's not difficult to see what direction that change has gone in. We had masses of antioxidants, now we don't. We had masses of chemicals that protected us from our own hormones, now we don't. So you start thinking about things like our predisposition to estrogen-dependent cancer. For example, estrogen can initiate and fuel cancer, and it's become an epidemic. Yet at one time we were flooded with chemicals that inhibited our own estrogens as the normal state. So there's lots of things spill off in all sorts of directions. Not just to do with our state of mind, but our general level of health or lack of it. Right, we're going to get into split brain stuff now, so I think we'll take one last break, and this is the last section. So try and come back.